One of the things I love about the Bible is that it so accurately and compassionately reflects what it means to walk with God as flawed human beings. And one of the reasons I trust in the integrity of the Bible is that it doesn't idolize anybody. I just think of the way that people today sometimes worship their leaders, whether they be political or religious, even when they're still living. And then I look at the Bible as it describes its greatest heroes, the political and religious founders of the Jewish faith and the Jewish state. And even though the text is describing its founding fathers, we find shockingly human people who are often afraid, who lie and get angry, who are often immoral. And two of the greatest, Moses and David, who were murderers. And this is one of the facets of the flawless integrity of the Bible. It is a progressive revelation, a pulling back of the curtain between a God who holds time in his hands and humans who plod along, prisoners of our culture, our presuppositions, our hells and our heavens. Spend enough time thinking of all the things that crop our thinking, and it makes me wonder if we have even a remote hope of pleasing God, let alone of understanding him well enough to follow him. And yet, the Bible makes clear that God thinks we can understand him well enough to know him as a friend even, to follow him as a guide, and to honor him with our actions. And the fact that the Bible uses very flawed people to illustrate this should not depress us. It should lead us to worship, I think. Should also be a warning to us. Just because someone important in the Bible does something a certain way doesn't mean that you should. The Bible accurately reports all sorts of actions by its leading characters, both good, bad, and sometimes mistaken. Even Jesus, who was sinless, is not a model of behavior that you can reproduce in everyday life. That is, unless you too are in the habit of healing people with mud that you've made by spitting on the ground. Now, this is why I was not a big fan of the "what would Jesus do" fad that swept Christian circles a few years ago. It sounds good, but it's hard to define what it really means. And so, what is the Bible then? Now, I've often said that it's not a self-help manual, but it is a kind of manual. It is a manual filled with examples not of what God is looking for, but who God is looking for. It's a book about God's heart and what a fulfilling, fruitful, and intimate friendship with him is fueled by. And I've said all of this to frame a 5-week series that Paul and I are starting on an important leader in the history of the Jewish people, a man called Nehemiah. He was a skilled administrator. He's a visionary, a man used by God to rebuild a Jewish nation out of a scattered people. And we're going to learn practical lessons from him. Now, what is it then that we will be learning from Nehemiah that is different from, say, using Jesus to make me a better CEO, as some have done in recent books? We are going to discover that Nehemiah's success as an administrator and a political leader are not based on a list of key behaviors that you should emulate. Rather, he's a role model to us not because of his success, but because of what his success flowed from. And that is a heart that put God first in everything. Now, if you like dates, we have very accurate ones for the events of the book of Nehemiah, 444 before Jesus. So let me fill in a little bit the historical picture. Around 1,000 years before Nehemiah, Moses had led the people of Israel out of Egypt. And God had promised to take them back to the land of Palestine, where their forefather, Abraham, had settled. And God was working on a larger plan in which all of the peoples of the earth would be brought back into relationship with him. And he identified the land of Palestine as his promised land. And I need to make something clear that's caused a lot of confusion in people's minds. This promised or Holy Land was special not because it was promised to the Jews, but because God chose it as the geographical center point on earth to achieve his goals of blessing all nations. It's a promise he had made to Abraham, and God instructed the Israelites to expel the inhabitants of Palestine from the land, not because he thought that the Jews were more worthy, but because people of the land had broken faith with God, filled it with violence, injustice, and some of the most perverted forms of idol worship. The fact that God chose Abraham and his descendant as a means of blessing all nations did not make them better than any of the other nations. This is underscored by the fact that as the Israelites got ready to enter the land of Palestine, God warns them that his patience with the people of the land is up, and he's using the Israelites to judge the people of the land. And furthermore, God states that exactly the same agreement applied to the Jews. If they took up violence, injustice, and idolatry in God's land, then God would call another foreign nation to destroy them in exactly the same way. And indeed, this is exactly what happened. God led the Israelites out of Egypt, but he was never able to get Egypt out of the Israelites. And like his long-standing patience with the people of the land before he allowed them to be conquered by the Jews, he waited some 700 years before he allowed the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to utterly destroy what remained of the Jewish state in 589 BC and carry much of its population away to what is today Iraq and Iran, 145 years before the events we will be studying in Nehemiah. And you can read about the fall of Jerusalem in the book of Daniel. Empires changed, and the scattered Jews found themselves living in the next great world empire, Persia. And it was Cyrus, the leader of this great empire, that allowed the first return of the Jews under a leader named Ezra, 70 years after they had been taken off into captivity. But this group was small, and as we shall see in our series, was treated with great suspicion by the people who had remained in the land, as well as those imported there by the Babylonians. And here the situation stabilized for another 75 years until the time of Nehemiah. Jerusalem's walls and temple were a ruin, and an early attempt under Ezra to rebuild the city wall had failed. The small Jewish return party from Ezra's day had run out of steam, given up on a vision of the land as God's space for blessing the nations, and settled down around the countryside to make the best of it. And this, then, is the situation you should imagine in your mind's eye as we begin to read Nehemiah chapter 1. So Nehemiah 1, the words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. And now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. Well, we find ourselves in Susa. It's one of the Persian imperial cities where the king's winter palace was. It was too hot in the summer. This city is the stage for a lot of what happens to the Jewish people during this period. It's the context for the story of Daniel and the story of Esther. Interestingly enough, Susa is one of several places from which the Babylonians had previously deported people to repopulate Samaria in Israel in place of the exiled Israelites. And 450 years later, at the time of Jesus, the Jews still hated the Samaritans. And the distance between Susa and Jerusalem was considerable, and Nehemiah is understandably interested in what the situation is in their homeland that 150 years before had been called Judah. And he is particularly interested in what has happened to the Jewish people that were not deported by the Babylonians at the time, and also what remained of the descendants of the small group of returnees that had gone back 75 years before in the time of Ezra. And they said to me, verse 3, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Verse 4, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. We're only 4 verses now into the book of Nehemiah, and I've already learned something really profound about Nehemiah. He is someone who cares deeply about things that are bigger than himself. And the book of Nehemiah is focused on a large and politically dangerous project, the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. But I want you to be able to see through this wall and realize that for Nehemiah, the ruined walls are symbolic of a larger, deeply painful picture. It's the shame of the people of God and the associated shame of the name of God. And the chapter we're about to go through together is centered on the prayer of Nehemiah. And we're going to see in the coming chapters that this is an answered prayer. And it is a fair question to ask. So what is the nature of powerful praying? And the answer is that there is a foundation to powerful prayer that begins before you open your mouth. And it's an attitude that is more interested in the honor of God's name than the honor of your name. And the book of Nehemiah is, in part, a glimpse into his personal journal. And as we get to know this man over the next month, we're going to find that he is passionately motivated by the shame of the people of God and the disrepute that God's name has fallen into. It is one thing to choose God when there is fire and smoke on the mountain. But do you choose God when he doesn't seem to have been heard from in 150 years? Now, this is the kind of man that Nehemiah is. You might say he is one of the remaining keepers of the flame, removed by time and geography from the God of his forefathers, looking at the oil lamp but imagining the mountain. And I call this attitude choosing God, and it's worth asking yourself, what motivates me to pray? How interested am I in the reputation of God among the nations? Am I grieved by the shame of God? Am I grieved when God's people shame him? And it is these questions that form Nehemiah's value system. It is this attitude that makes his prayer powerful. And it is this fire in his belly that will later make him an effective leader. And the challenge here is this. If God is, for you, mainly useful because he might make your life better, you are not only in danger of creating a God made in your own image, you will also rapidly grow bored to tears with prayer itself. If that is where you are at in your prayer life, be encouraged. Nehemiah teaches us that there is much more to prayer. Now let's pay attention to how he prays. Verse 5, and I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants. Well, I'm fascinated at the prayers of people in the Bible who are facing crisis. And whether it's King Hezekiah's prayer in 2 Kings chapter 19, when the Assyrians were starving out the city of Jerusalem, or Jeremiah praying as the Babylonians encircled the same city later, just before they destroyed it, that's in Jeremiah 32, or the apostles praying in Acts 4 when the Jewish leaders tried to kill off the early church, they all start by telling God first who he is. You are the God of heaven. And this means you are not just the God of a patch of ground hundreds of miles away. You are universal in your rule, and your power is over that of other gods. And this is what I call the choosing God part of prayer. Prayer is not first and foremost the way you get things. Prayer is nothing more and nothing less than the verbal expression of a loving relational bond. Like a marriage, without choice, there is not relationship. And the good that comes from a life lived in relationship with your spouse or with God is similar in that the goodness is an expression of the relationship and not its goal. We get good things because we choose God. We do not choose God to get good things, if that makes sense. Now, secondly, Nehemiah says, "You are a God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments." And within the context of relationship, there is the freedom to challenge. And what we find so often in biblical praying is that, one, people are choosing God in spite of the fact that he seems to be inactive and far off. And two, biblical prayers challenge God to act in accordance with his promises. And you should not be afraid to put the honor of God's name on the line, if indeed it is the honor of God's name that you are interested in. Now, this is exactly what Nehemiah does. But number three, biblical praying is often characterized by persistence. And persistence in prayer is evidence that we are serious about the honor of God's name. And Nehemiah states that he spent days and nights in prayer. Now, what specifically did he express to God during those hours? Well, let's pick it up again. Nehemiah says, "I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses." Well, we have just seen that the first thing that Nehemiah models for us in prayer is choosing God. The second aspect of Nehemiah's prayer that I want to highlight is confession. Now, today we consider prayers of confession to be both individual and mostly private. Our modern sense of fairness and our value of personal freedom mold our understanding of sin and its consequences. We do not like it when the sins of others harm us. If possible, we sue people when they do. And most certainly, we recoil at the notion that we as individuals might be held responsible for the sins of our community, even if we are personally innocent of them. Yet we find over and over again in the Bible examples of innocent people who stood before God and took responsibility for the sins of their communities, even though they were innocent of them individually. Moses did this. Isaiah did this. Daniel did this. And please don't miss that this is the material from which the gospel itself is cut, because Jesus, who did not even belong to our community, joined it first so that he could take responsibility for our community's sin before God. I do not want to downplay the individual responsibility of people for their lives before God, but I am pointing out that our culture filters for that message and sifts out the greater part of biblical teaching that over and over again in the Bible's greatest examples of prayer talks more about our sin than my sin. This reinforces something we already mentioned about Nehemiah. He is a great leader not because he wants to change the situation of his community. Most leaders do this. Nehemiah starts by taking responsibility for the shame of his people, even though it resulted from the behavior of his ancestors hundreds of years before. And here we get a glimpse that the Bible does not see sin as a behavior to be changed, but as a stain that needs to be cleansed. The biblical understanding of sin is that it is contagious, and it stains all who are related to it. And I know that this is a very unpopular idea in the modern world, but you will struggle to understand many things in the Bible if you don't see this distinction. Confessing the sins of other people as your own because you participate in the shame of your race is the most Christ-like thing you will probably ever do. And so Nehemiah says, "We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses." But Nehemiah isn't done. In his prayer, he has defined who God is. That's the choosing part. He has defined the nature of his community, the confession part. And now comes the promises part, which link the two together. He says to God, "Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand.'" Now, there are many forms of prayer. And what Nehemiah is modeling for us here is what I would call wrestling with God praying. This is a form of argument, but it is based on God's own words and his honor. And so Nehemiah puts God's promises and therefore God's integrity on the line. And over again, God says he would scatter his people, but he also said he would gather them. This is not only a plea, it is a claim rooted in the promises of God. And as a side note, is why it's so important to know what the promises of God actually are. Christians waste time claiming promises for themselves that God never made, while missing promises sitting in plain sight that they never claim. And this is one of the unfortunate results of the individualistic society we are the product of. So if you've been tracking with me, Nehemiah has followed a tried and true model of biblical crisis praying that we find many other places in the Bible. He has chosen God. He has confessed to God. He has challenged God. And now he ends with the part that we usually start with, asking God. Verse 11, "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. Give success to your servant today and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king." I want you to notice something about the asking part of this prayer. It is short. And this is characteristic of the great prayers that are recorded for us in the Bible. Even when these prayers are the result of great crisis, the asking part is usually the smallest part of the prayer. It's almost by the by. And Nehemiah is able to confidently ask for success in his mission because he is confident in the promises of God to the people of God, and he can trust God to work out what the details of success look like. And this is a teaching on prayer that is challenging to us, because if you pause for a moment and think about how we pray, either individually or in groups, we tend to spend the vast majority of our time asking. I am not, of course, suggesting that asking is wrong, but I do submit that it is out of balance with the models we have in the Bible for what wrestling in prayer looks like. One of the side effects I've noticed as I have watched myself and my Christian community pray is that because we spend most of our time asking, we tend to think that wrestling in prayer with God means asking over and over for the same things, and that it is persistence in asking that breaks down the door with God. And what we find in the Bible, however, is that wrestling with God in prayer is mostly choosing God and confessing to God and challenging God. The asking bit is something of a conclusion when the work is done. So when we are taught by Jesus that persistent prayer is powerful, he's talking about more than repetitively asking for something. Wrestling with God is built on the foundation of relationship. You do not challenge a king you do not know. And the fact that the creator of the universe invites us into a conversation with him that is not one-sided, but that we in fact can argue with God, is one of the most remarkable teachings of the Bible. This license to argue comes from Nehemiah's conviction that his concern for the shame of God's people is God's concern, and that it is a righteous concern because it stems from an attitude of heart that respects and honors God. This is why Nehemiah can boldly say, "Be attentive to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name." It is people who fear the name of God, that is, who honor it, who have the confidence to wrestle with God. And earlier we saw that Nehemiah accepted responsibility for the stain of Israel's sin, even though he was not responsible for it. And now we observe the reverse. Nehemiah boldly stands on the fact that he and a remnant of others continue to honor the name of God above all else, and in spite of the fact that the vast majority of the dispersed Jews that had become complacent and had lost the vision of God's mission for his people, Nehemiah asks that God will accept the righteousness of a few and accept it as a contagious holiness that will cleanse the people and attract God's blessing to the whole Jewish community. Nehemiah assumes that the shame of the Jewish community is not irreversible, and just as they were living the shame of deeds done long before them, Nehemiah teaches us by his prayer life that a defiled people can be cleansed by the few. You see where this is going, don't you? This is the gospel, where the sin of many is covered by the righteousness of the one. There is so much confusion about prayer and spiritual warfare that I hope you have found this outline of the ingredients for arguing with God helpful. Again, they are choose God, confess to God, challenge God, and ask God. And these are the things that the champions of our faith did when they were in crisis. Do this and you will not feel the need for modern-day prophets or words of knowledge from others or contrived yes-no tests of the will of God. If you have the confidence to wrestle with God and the willingness to lay yourself on the altar for the good of God's kingdom, you have followed in the way of Jesus, and you have not only tasted what is at the heart of being a servant leader, you have become the gospel. That is, you are on your way to being God's answer to your prayers.